welcome. We're going to be talking about the built environment today and how buildings can impact our health. So not surprisingly, 90% of our time is spent in buildings, and about 2/3 of that is at home. We spend a ton of time at home, and about 80% of our life is within a 20-mile radius. We talked a lot in previous classes about how environmental exposures and our experiences can affect the way that our DNA works. And this occurs through epigenetics, which again is genetics is our DNA. Epigenetics is above the DNA. So how are these exposures influencing the way that our DNA work? So we talked about some that are like stress and air quality, nutrition, and sleep. These are going to impact our health. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more today. As we're thinking about our built environment, we've been talking a lot about different types of exposures that can impact our health. So these are typical ones that you might see potentially indoors, and where those sources actually are and what those potential health effects are expected to be. So some of them you might be very familiar with, others maybe less so. But there's quite a few of these in here that are going to be having long-term impacts. And so some of the ones that you might not necessarily be familiar with as much might be these polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PBDEs. So these are flame retardants. So these are persistent these are persistent substances that stay in the environment. So as we are thinking about these, this is not a one and done type of scenario. Keep them in mind. So the pictures that I'm going to be showing you today come from Dr. Tsongas, who's amazing, and he used to come to our previous classes to talk to us about mold. So he inspects homes all over the Pacific Northwest, and he's a wonderful, wonderful resource. So we've been talking a lot about some of the built environment, and so I want to share with you some of his pictures of how these components may kind of start to fit together. So again, these are his slides, but one of the things that I want to make sure that you're familiar with is that he studies mold and dampness and how those two things can impact not necessarily only buildings, but also what I care very much about is how they impact our health. So as we're kind of going through these things, so mold and some of these exposures can cause and really influence allergic reactions and asthma, irritation, and there are some toxic effects that may also occur. So it's not necessarily just new asthma or fatigue, but also triggering symptoms for those with existing asthma. And so we're seeing that many people are being affected to some degree. So that could be current asthmatics, or it could be that asthmatics are suffering more when mold is present. So it's really, really hard to eliminate exposure to mold as it's going through, but being able to eliminate some of that can reduce respiratory symptoms, which is one of the things that we're looking for. So getting rid of mold is hard. So dampness is a trigger for mold, which is probably not a surprise for you. So if you have excess dampness, very often there is mold that will be associated with that, whether or not you see mold. Sometimes you might only smell it. Sometimes you might not have any indication of it at all. But if you do have mold visibly, it's often and almost always considered the result of excess dampness, whether or not that dampness is reported. And often the way that this occurs is through elevated indoor relative humidity. So we're going to be talking about what relative indoor humidity means and what that looks like. But spoiler alert, if you're seeing a bunch of condensation on your windows in cold areas of the house, that is an indicator that you have excess dampness. And the issue related to built environment is that low-income housing is especially prone to dampness because there often is a lack of maintenance related to it. There may be additional individuals living in a space, and there's a lot of moisture generation that is occurring as a result of the number of occupants. So we're going to be talking about all of those things. So again, this is from Dr. Tsongas' slides, and what you will often see is bathrooms. This is where you will frequently see issues related to excess dampness, which is not surprising given showers. But if you don't have an area with an exhaust fan, you almost always are going to have issues related to mold. So as we're thinking about it, there are some basic conditions that we want you to consider leading to mold growth. So think about this humidity. So our air holds water, and temperature influences that quite a bit. So at any given temperature, the relative humidity, or RH, which is measured as a percentage, you can imagine it as the amount of water vapor that's in the air over the maximum water vapor the air can hold. So at 100%, the air is saturated, holds the maximum amount of water. So what are we kind of looking for in terms of what an ideal relative humidity is? So again, at 100%, it's fully saturated, as much water vapor as it can possibly hold. So in the Pacific Northwest, we are around 50 to 70%. You want to be around 50 to 60% to avoid mold and mildew. And so if we can get to 30 to 40%, that is the best for health and comfort. So in commercial buildings, which have awesome air exchanges, which they can recycle the air every 2 to 3 hours, for example, 35% is where they're going. That's really hard to achieve unless you have a dehumidifier and or air conditioner. So Dr. Tsongas loves having a hygrometer for measuring maximum and minimum humidity, and this might be especially important if you have an area that might have extra dampness. So I was surprised by this. I was expecting, winter are wet months, and that is when we will have the most relative indoor humidity. And that's not the case. So fall and spring have our most humidity in our climate. And we will talk about why that is. And it turns out that it has a lot to do with the temperature. So at 70 degrees, you can keep that temperature consistent. But if you increase the amount of water, what are you expecting to see for the relative humidity? And theoretically, you should be answering in your head, well, if you're increasing the amount of water, temperature staying the same, you probably are increasing the relative humidity. And you would be right. That is exactly the case. Because you are increasing the amount of water vapor in the air. But what if you are decreasing the temperature, but keeping that humidity the same? So this might be a little bit more confusing. And this actually also can increase the relative humidity in the air. And this is because it's the maximum amount of water vapor that the air can hold. Colder air can hold less water vapor. So as we are looking at this, some of the things that we will see is we will have high indoor air relative humidity. This is really common for widespread mold growth. And you will see these cold surfaces. This is so important. It's cold surfaces with this localized high relative humidity. And we're going to talk about exactly what that looks like. And you're going to see a lot of pictures where it's going to be burned into your brain. And then often you will see abnormally wet surfaces. So this could be from leaks or from other things related to plumbing. So let's dive in. So it could be caused by a water leak. I'm sure that you have seen examples of these in the past. More common, you will see mold around windows and drywall. And this is the difference between, we have that warm room, and then as the warm air kind of goes up to these cold uninsulated windows, you will have this condensation of water vapor up against the windows and those air pockets. And this is where you're going to start to see some mold. You'll also find them in mold on drywall. Mold loves drywall. And in these lower wall corners. So exterior corners, they are typically colder, and you will see more mold growth in those areas. So spores are everywhere. They are in the soil, they are inside, they can come in on our shoes. So these microscopic mold spores, they are dormant on surfaces unless the right conditions are present. And once the surface is wet enough, they will reproduce. And they will release spores through the air, and they will continue to grow into a colony that you can see. So as we're going through, they will need some food, and this is also often where drywall will come in. So in addition to growing mold, growth also requires oxygen, a really good food source, and some warm temperatures. So like anything like paper, loves it, and also leather. So I was surprised to hear this when I first heard it. So like shoes and cold closets are prime areas of growth for mold. So in under optimum conditions, like you will start to see mold in a few days to a few weeks. So this is strongly dependent on temperature. So in colder environments, you might not see it as frequently, but say after a disaster, and we're talking about flooding in a hurricane prone area, you can imagine it's going to go very, very quickly. Okay. And because that cold winter weather and our summer, those are not necessarily our periods where we're going to have the most relative indoor humidity. It turns out, again, fall and spring is when we have our warmer weather, lots of moisture, and that is when we typically see most relative high indoor relative humidity. So here's some pictures. We're just going to go through a couple. So here are leather goods and what they look like when they get exposed to mold. And spoiler alert, this is in a Malaysian mall. So when COVID hit and they shut down all of these malls in early spring, they had 2 months of no air conditioning. We are in Malaysia, it's warm there. And so this is what happens when you have this high indoor humidity, very little air circulation. You're starting to see a lot of mold growth on some of these leather products. So if you can smell mold, it exists. You will smell these volatile organic compounds. We've talked about them a lot previously, and they can be really irritating to our mucous membranes and our bodies. So the concentrations in the air do not have to be high in order for us to smell them. We are amazingly good at smelling these. They aren't necessarily highly toxic, and they are not necessarily mycotoxins either. So many, but not all molds produce mycotoxins, some of which are poisonous. So that was one of the misconceptions I had as I was first getting started is I was thinking, well, if it's mold, it's definitely toxic, but it's not necessarily, that's not the case. So there are about 300 species that are toxic. And after years and years of doing this, Dr. Tsongas is saying, it's really, really hard just to, as you're looking at visible mold in a space, to know whether it's one of those toxic species. So we are using the principle of like, if we see mold, we are just going to try to remove it altogether because we don't necessarily know what species it is how dangerous it might be to our health. But as we're going through, keep in mind that if you see mold, we need to get it out. So we are constantly exposed to mold. It's everywhere. We talk about that a lot. We see it everywhere. So there are individuals who are especially vulnerable to some of these health problems. So it could be individuals who already have allergies and asthma, so they are having additional sensitivities when mold is present, for example. It could be individuals who have weakened immune systems, and they could be, because they have chemotherapy right now and they're going through cancer, or it could be they have a weakened immune system because of HIV and AIDS. There are also individuals who are at-risk groups. And so we talked about some of the vulnerable populations. So these could be pregnant women or elderly or infants. But any of us are susceptible to potential irritation and possible problems if mold exposures are sufficiently high. One of the issues related to understanding who's most at risk and what those impacts are dust mites. So the diagnosis of health problems are really similar. So dust mite issues and mold issues are very, very similar. So sometimes it can be really hard to distinguish which it is. When we're talking about being prone to indoor mold, so housing with really high relative indoor humidities, we talked about that. So if you see places without bathroom fans, exhaust fans, that's really important, something that you need to keep in mind. The other places where you should if you see these conditions, put in the back of your head, okay, keep an eye out for mold, are these older housings. Anytime you have single pane, metal framed windows with blinds or drapes closed, you can imagine you have that perfect pocket for having this really cold air, high relative indoor humidity in a local space. Also with older housing, so often they might not have adequate insulation, which kind of separates that cold air from that warmer air. Any room that is kind of shut off from heating sources or used intermittently, maybe you aren't using all of the spaces and you have a room closed, and so that might be a place that has additional relative indoor humidity because it's colder. And any sort of place that has this cold surface area, so an uninsulated ceiling or an uninsulated wall or an uninsulated floor area. These are things to keep in mind. So under carpet pads, or if you're above a concrete slab floor, behind furniture. So as you're going through, kind of keep in mind these little cold pockets because they make a difference. So how do you know? So these are indicators of high indoor relative humidity. So one is that musty smell. So that's from your VOCs. If you see any mold, this is an obvious indicator. That is a key indicator that there is high indoor relative humidity present. If you see continuous condensation on windows, so that is also an issue. And then whenever you see water stains, so this could be, or walls dripping wet, hopefully your walls are not dripping wet, but these are indicators that you have a lot of relative indoor humidity in the house that needs to be reduced. The other thing that I undervalued before learning from Dr. Tsongas is that, as we are living in these smaller living spaces, during the heating seasons, we get also moisture from combustion sources, not only our furnaces and fireplaces and our heaters, but these can mount. But the second one, this is what blew my mind, is that when you have a large number of occupants, we are producing an immense amount of moisture. So when you have 3 to 4 family members, you have 14 pints of moisture that's being produced. And this comes from many different sources. But as you kind of add up all of these, the 14 pints plus, the bathing in the showers and the plants and the dishwashing, etc., you get about 3 gallons a day of moisture that's being generated. So these are some additional pictures. So again, we see condensation around toilets all the time. And so often you will find mold behind the toilet. You also might see wetness on the ground around. So Dr. Tsongas loves his toilet paper tests. I super appreciate it. So whenever I see some wet toilet paper, you have this really nice indicator that, there's some moisture there, because you can see it really quickly wick up the water. He also loves it for testing fans. So if your fan is working properly, it will hold a piece of toilet paper up. It is showing that the fan is working. It is pulling moisture up and out of the air. And the other thing is, he leaves his bathroom fan on for about an hour after showering to really remove all that moisture. So he will talk about how a 10-minute shower takes about 6 hours to fully dry out. So I don't know about you, but I rarely leave my bathroom fan on for an hour after showering. But I've got to tell you, I definitely leave it on for way longer now that I've met Dr. Tsongas than beforehand. So this is an image of underneath a rug, and you can see that mold being covered. You can have an uninsulated floor, so there's a cold space below it, and you can see that there's that temperature differential that we're seeing. And often you will see it at the eaves. So the eaves are, up above us, and as the roof is coming down, so right along these areas where, this is where those little pockets of cold air can really come through. So you can see this ghosting throughout. There are also issues related to roof leaks. So often we're in the Pacific Northwest, we have a ton of moss in our areas, and that can cause some problems. So it can get between the shingles and especially at the joints, allows rainwater to kind of just sit there like a sponge, and it kind of wicks and stays there, and then it will leak through down to the ceiling, and it can cause some problems. So fortunately, we have some metals that are highly effective at preventing moss. So if you've ever seen like these copper strips, you can put those on your roof to mitigate moss growth. Again, it can be expensive, for example, but that's one of the things that you could do, for example. There's also issues related to concrete slab on grade. So concrete slab, that I think we know what that is. That is a layer of concrete. Slab on grade is just a fancy name for dirt. So whenever you have a concrete slab that's poured on top of dirt, this is where you might see some things. So, for example, this is a picture of a floor where you have this concrete slab on grade, and then on top of that they put this linoleum floor. And what you will have is that there's a lot of moisture that comes as concrete is drying, and that mold will start to accumulate in those areas. For those of you with houses, think about your landscaping. Make sure that your ground is sloping away from your house, not towards it. So this is a picture where you can see the earth is sloping towards the building, and also they are watering all those plants right next to the foundation. So these can cause some problems. So this is the picture from the inside, and you can see a little bit, the picture is a little bit dark, but you'll see some staining on the carpets. Because this is how the moisture wicked through the concrete slab and started producing some problems related to it. So this is that inside of that same building. So for rentals and tenants, so these are examples of the pictures that you're going to see coming up are, these are unacceptable conditions that Dr. Songas has observed. And in each case, the tenants made repeated requests for repairs to be made, but these were often ignored. And so these are things that we need to keep in mind as public health professionals. So for example, like this is a bathroom, and there should not be areas where water can go back in behind. So this is a problem of water leaking into the exposed wall cavity, and this can cause some mold problems. Here's another one looking at behind the toilet. Often mold might just be painted over by property maintenance, and this does not get rid of the spores. This is in a child's bedroom. We talked about children not being young adults, how they are breathing, how they are younger. So again, you can see this localized mold growth right next to the corners of these walls in these low positions, and also next to the windows. But this is where the child is sleeping. This is the air that the child is breathing. So as we go through, so for this first case, the smoke alarm also wasn't working. There was no carbon monoxide alarm. So this has been required since 2011. And then there was rotted front porch steps, broken handrails, and the tenant had fallen. So, you know, these are some problems. And sometimes with these various rentals, the tenant might not be able to afford to move to a new place because it is both expensive to move, and also the rents may be more expensive in other areas. So there are some severe challenges and inequities that are occurring. So what should the tenant do? So tenants are often exposed to mold, and we know that this is having some adverse health effects, especially in low rent or multifamily housing areas. And so often renters can be alerted to the potential for mold problems. And so if you have to sign a mold addendum, that is a super indicator that there is something there. So most landlords or property managers are pretty good about complaints, but not all, definitely not all. So for those that aren't, that can be a problem. And then what do we do? And so we're going to get into that a little bit. And often, sometimes the mold is caused by tenants, but generally not. Usually this is something that was in place well before. The other issue is that tenants who complain sometimes will face retaliation. So many are afraid to complain, especially if they have limited options of where to go after. So this is a social justice issue. So vulnerable tenants should get reasonable repairs in a timely manner when the conditions for living are threatening their health and safety. But this is not the case that we're sometimes seeing. So here's another case. So this is relating to electrical. So in this first case, you can see that the electrical outlet isn't attached to the wall. In this middle picture, you can see how the downspout is right next to an open electrical box. And the third picture is just showing sewage draining down one of the walls. So these are problems. These are major problems. Rodents are able to get in, and we've talked a lot about vector-borne disease. So as we have these various conditions, you can see how they all kind of come together to influence our health. So, like we said, many tenants cannot afford to move to a new place, and this is where we start to get into a lot of problems. So the Oregon Law Center is one place. They have been amazing for helping individuals get legal aid for services. The 115 lawyers was from previously, but you can imagine they are getting a ton of requests, but they'll take on the case. So know that these individuals exist. As we were thinking about this, the good news is that from a building science point of view, so indoor moisture problems can be resolved. And so there are some tricks that we can use to implement those. And especially for those of you who are new homeowners, congratulations, by the way, it's amazing. Here are some straightforward methods that are pretty reasonable. Okay, so first, find ways of lowering surface humidity. And some ways that you can do that is you can keep your shades and blinds up. You can replace aluminum windows. So these are becoming more and more common. Single pane glass windows are now being replaced with double pane glass windows, and this is now the industry standard. And you can move furniture and mattresses away from exterior walls to get more air circulation around those areas. You can go even further. So to remove those indoor sources, so make sure that you vent your clothes dryers outdoors rather than putting that hot, warm air inside. You can remove firewood from being stored indoors. You can turn off your humidifier or turn on your dehumidifier. You can reduce the number of plants. So Dr. Songus was once saying, why would anyone need 50 plants in the house? And I think I went home and counted way more than 50, and I told my husband, and he laughed at me. Okay, plants are my co-pilot. So keep that in mind. So plants produce a lot of moisture. As you're thinking about these things, fix your leaky plumbing as soon as you know that it's leaking. Know that that is a major source. And also you can really look into these louvered doors. So these are the doors where like at a certain angle you can see through, but that allows air circulation. He also talks about how you can undercut doors. So you can raise them a little bit so you get that air circulation underneath the door for flow. Finally, so you can cover your crawl spaces on the ground underneath your places with a moisture barrier. You can carry gutter downspout water really far away from your house. You can seal off slab edges. You can slope ground away from your foundation. You can connect exhaust fans and really make sure that that is being vented outside. And you can remove moss from your roof shingles. There are also moss pellets that exist related to that. Where these issues start to overlap relate to disasters. So once a disaster hits, so say a hurricane comes through, for example, or we have an earthquake that causes massive flooding, for example, because pipes are broken. You have about 24 to 48 hours before mold starts to grow. You do not have much time. Mold remediation can be really expensive. Soap and water, they work. They are very effective for removing mold. Do not use bleach. It won't really work well on porous surfaces, and it actually reacts with molds. So soap and water is your friend. But often, especially when really wet with wet spots, you just need to tear out some of those affected surfaces, like some of the drywall, for example. If you need protective gear, there's a place in Southeast Portland that's great and it has lots of it. But if there's a disaster or if there's an issue, never say mold. You have a mold issue because it will never be covered by insurance. I think, so Dr. Songus will say, I think you meant you have a dampness problem, which I greatly appreciate. So you don't have a mold problem, you have a dampness problem. So if you go into the EPA, there is no limit of like what an appropriate level of mold is. It doesn't exist. So as you are kind of going through, again, the things that they say to do is controlling moisture. So trying to get that mold off with soap and water as fast as possible. Allow things to dry before they become problematic. Wear an N95 mask so you don't breathe in some of these spores. And again, wear gloves so you're not touching all of these spores and mold with your bare hands. Also, we have our eyes are sensitive, so you can wear goggles as well. So again, if you're seeing visible mold, you do not need to test. You know that it is present. But again, there is no limit for what is an appropriate level of mold. There is no regulation for that. Surprisingly, or rather not surprisingly, is that there are inequities related to these exposure to mold in homes. So lower socioeconomic is associated with high moldiness index values. I don't think this would surprise any of you. But as we're kind of pulling together these social determinants of health and these cumulative impacts, here's another one for us. We're moving into a new building in 4th and Montgomery very soon. So this is the new School of Public Health, which is awesome. So it's a big building. They have been putting it together for quite a long time, which is wonderful. As they're starting to go through, there are considerations related to LEED. So this is a way of being environmentally friendly. But there's a downside related to LEED in that in order to get LEED certification and or the tax credits that come from LEED certification, you have to pay an immense amount of money to get that certification. And this isn't just a one-time fee. Like this is for like the registration and for the building review and for how big the building is and all of these bits from the beginning to the review process and the review all the way through. So this is a limitation for some individuals. They might want to do these practices, but they might not be able to afford the LEED certification. So with all of these fees, how could all individuals have equal access to these tax credits if they build appropriately. So here are some discussion questions that you should consider and keep in the back of your head of like, who should get these tax credits and how? And so it's very, very similar with like in food systems, the label of organics. So many farmers may practice organic farming, but in order to get that organics certification, you have to pay quite a bit of money. So they might not be able to afford that. Finally, related to built environment, we can't go past thinking about redlining. This had a huge impact on prior health, and all the way up to now, a huge amount of inequity resulted in this. And if you are unfamiliar with the concept of redlining, I highly recommend that you watch, there's a beautiful video related to it. This talks about, in Baltimore specifically, but there were areas that were redlined, which were discussed as being undesirable to live. And spoiler alert, those were areas where there were often people of color living in those areas. This is a problem because you cannot generate generational wealth if you aren't able to necessarily own your home and make those changes to it. So here are some discussion questions that you can think about relating to the built environment and redlining. But spoiler alert is, it's a major, major problem. Do not devalue it. Do not underestimate the impacts that these issues have had on the systemic racism that we've seen and the systemic inequality that we continue to experience. This has been occurring for a long time, and it has impacts on our health.